In 1315, Europe faced the worst winter in 500 years. Temperatures plummeted to extremes not seen in centuries, with some regions experiencing below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow buried entire villages for months. Crops had failed the previous summer. Stored grain was already running low. Yet medieval peasants survived at rates higher than modern populations during comparable winter disasters. How? Because they followed a protocol, not luck, not hope, a systematic sequence of preparations refined over centuries through trial and error, passed from generation to generation, validated through survival. This protocol began in late August, before the first leaf changed colour. It did not end until February, when the ground finally thawed enough to work again. Every step had a purpose. Every action had been calculated through bitter experience. Nothing was random. Modern survival experts study this protocol today. Archaeologists have validated it through excavation and experimentation. Historians have documented it through guild records and manor accounts. This was not primitive guesswork. This was engineering. Thermal engineering, food science, risk management, psychology. And when you understand each phase of the protocol, you realize medieval people were not struggling in darkness. They were executing a system that worked. Today, we are going to rebuild that system, phase by phase, step by step. Phase 1. Before the leaves turn. August to September. The medieval calendar divided winter preparation into 3 distinct phases. Each phase had specific tasks that could not be delayed. Miss a deadline and survival became uncertain. Phase 1 began on August 1st and ended on September 29th, the Feast of Michaelmas. Medieval people called this period the preparation window. Modern survival analysts call it the foundation phase, because everything that came after depended on getting this phase right. Section 1. The firewood calculation. Medieval peasants did not guess how much firewood they needed. They calculated it. And the mathematics they used reveals something remarkable about how they understood thermal energy 600 years before thermodynamics existed as a formal science. They started with the constraints. A typical peasant household, 4 people, 1 room, approximately 14 square meters. Winter duration, Michaelmas, September 29th, to Candlemas, February 2nd. That is 126 days of continuous cold. Historical experiments replicating medieval heating conditions demonstrate that it required approximately 50 kilograms of hardwood per day to maintain livable temperatures and provide fuel for cooking. The calculation was straightforward. 126 days times 50 kilograms equals 6,300 kilograms, over 6 tons of wood per family. Every winter. But here is where medieval precision becomes clear. Not all wood produced equal heat energy. Medieval woodcutters knew this centuries before anyone measured British thermal units or calculated energy density. Oak was the gold standard. Dense, slow-burning, high heat output. 1 kilogram of seasoned oak produced approximately 4 kilowatt-hours of thermal energy. Beech was nearly equivalent. Ash was acceptable. Coniferous wood was deliberately avoided for primary heating. Pine, spruce, fir, too much resin. They burned too fast, produced excessive smoke, and created dangerous spark showers that could ignite thatch roofs. The protocols specified oak or beech for overnight fires and primary heating. Faster burning woods were reserved for cooking fires that required quick heat. Medieval households began cutting firewood in August because wood required seasoning. Freshly cut wood contains 50 to 60% moisture by weight. That water must evaporate before the wood burns efficiently. Burning green wood wastes half the energy boiling water instead of producing heat. The seasoning protocol was specific. They cut the wood. They split it immediately. They stacked it in a specific pattern that maximized air circulation. The pattern was called a Holzhausen in Germanic regions. Circular stacks with the bark side facing outward, split side facing inward. Air flowed through the center. Rain shed off the bark. Properly stacked wood lost 30 to 40% of its moisture in 6 weeks. By the time first snow arrived, the wood was ready. This was not folklore. This was thermodynamics. Medieval peasants were calculating energy requirements, optimizing fuel selection, and engineering drying systems, without instruments, without formal education, through pure accumulated knowledge. Section 2. The shelter reinforcement. With firewood calculated and stacked, the next priority was preventing heat loss. Because generating heat was expensive in labor, retaining heat was free if done correctly. Medieval homes were simple structures, wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs. Dirt or stone floors, no insulation in the modern sense. Yet archaeological experiments demonstrate these structures could maintain indoor temperatures 10 to 15 degrees Celsius above outdoor temperatures with surprisingly modest fires. The secret was systematic sealing. The protocol began with wall inspection. Wattle and daub construction used woven branches, plastered with a mixture of clay, straw and animal dung. This material contracted and expanded with seasonal temperature changes. By late summer, cracks appeared. Every crack was a heat leak. The repair mixture was prepared in August. Clay from the riverbank, straw from the recent harvest, fresh dung from livestock. The proportions mattered. Too much clay and the plaster cracked again in winter. Too much straw and it lacked structural integrity. The ratio was typically 3 parts clay, 2 parts straw, 1 part dung. Medieval masons knew something: modern materials. Scientists have confirmed animal dung contains fibrous material and natural binding agents. It reinforces the clay matrix and reduces cracking. Roman engineers used the same principle 1,000 years earlier. Every crack was filled. Every gap was sealed. The work began at the roofline and proceeded downward. Gravity helped the fresh plaster settle and bond. But walls were only the beginning. Windows were the primary heat loss points. Glass was impossibly expensive. Most peasant windows were simply openings in the wall, sometimes covered with oiled linen or animal bladder for light transmission. The winter protocol required sealing these openings entirely. Shutters were installed. Gaps around shutters were stuffed with straw or moss. In extreme northern regions, some households mortared their windows shut for the entire winter, accepting total darkness over heat loss. This seems extreme until you understand the trade-off. Heat loss through a 1 square metre opening was equivalent to burning an additional 5 to 8 kilograms of firewood per day. Over 126 days, that opening cost 630 to 1,000 kilograms of extra fuel. Darkness was cheaper than that much additional labour. The final sealing step addressed the floor. Dirt floors were covered with a thick layer of straw or rushes. This served 3 purposes: insulation against ground cold, absorption of moisture, and critically, a renewable surface layer. As the top became soiled, fresh straw was added. By spring, the compressed layers were removed and used as fertilizer. The floor was literally rebuilt each year. Medieval peasants were solving heat retention problems through systematic engineering. They understood thermal mass, convective heat loss, and the insulating properties of trapped air. They just did not use those terms. If this level of medieval engineering surprises you, a quick like helps others discover that primitive often meant precisely calculated. It takes 1 second. Phase 2. When the days shorten. October to November. Phase 2 began on October 1st and ended on November 30th. This was called the slaughter season, not because of violence, but because of systematic food preservation that determined whether a family lived or died. Section 3. The Blood Month Protocol. Anglo-Saxons called November Blood Month. The name appears in manuscripts dating to the 800s. The reason was specific. This was the designated time for livestock slaughter and meat preservation. The timing was calculated. Animals had fattened on autumn forage and harvest waste. First frost had arrived, providing natural refrigeration for the preservation process. But deep winter had not yet set in, allowing extended outdoor work. The protocol was precise. Not all animals were slaughtered. Breeding stock was retained. Young animals with growth potential were retained. Only mature animals and those unlikely to survive winter feed scarcity were designated for slaughter. For a typical peasant household with 2 pigs, 3 chickens, and occasional access to communal livestock, the calculation was straightforward. 1 pig was slaughtered. This provided approximately 80 to 100 kilograms of meat. Properly preserved, this lasted through winter and into spring. The slaughter itself was a community event, because the work was intensive and time-sensitive. From killing to full preservation required 2 to 3 days of continuous work. Families coordinated. One family slaughtered on Monday. Neighbours assisted. That family reciprocated when neighbours slaughtered on Wednesday. The process was systematic. First, the blood was collected. Nothing was wasted. Blood was immediately cooked into blood sausage or black pudding. This had to be consumed within days, so the first week after slaughter meant eating relatively rich food. The carcass was then butchered. Specific cuts received specific preservation treatments. This was not random. Different cuts required different handling because of varying fat content, thickness, and intended storage duration. Lean cuts were salted. The salt ratio was critical. Too little and bacterial growth continued. Too much and the meat became inedible even after soaking. The protocol specified approximately 10 to 15% salt by weight for long-term preservation. Historical preservation manuals document ratios in this range, though some sources mention lighter salting of 3 to 4% for meat intended for consumption within weeks rather than months. Fattier cuts were both salted and smoked. The smoking process required 7 to 10 days. A dedicated smokehouse or chimney area was used. The wood selection mattered. Hardwoods like oak or hickory produced steady smoke with minimal resin. The temperature was kept low, between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius. Hot smoking cooked the meat. Cold smoking preserved it. The chemistry is straightforward. Smoke contains hundreds of compounds. Several are antibacterial. They penetrate the meat surface and create a preservation layer. Combined with salt and dehydration, this method could preserve meat for 6 to 8 months. Archaeological analysis of medieval preserved meat confirms bacterial growth was effectively halted. But meat was only one component of winter food stores. Section 4. The storage engineering. Preserved meat was useless without proper storage, and medieval storage was not just a cellar dug in the ground. It was engineered temperature control without refrigeration. The storage protocol had 3 components: the root cellar, the grain storage, and the active pantry. The root cellar was the foundation. This was dug below the frost line, typically 1.5 to 2 meters deep. The temperature at this depth remains remarkably stable. Even in regions with severe surface temperature swings, underground temperature at 2 meters depth varies only 5 to 10 degrees year-round. Medieval builders understood this empirically. Modern soil science explains why. Earth has high thermal mass. It absorbs and releases heat slowly. Once you get below the active surface layer affected by daily temperature cycles, the Earth becomes a natural temperature regulator. Archaeological excavations of medieval root cellars reveal sophisticated design. The entrance was often through the home interior, preventing cold air infiltration. The ceiling was low, reducing the air volume that needed cooling. Ventilation was minimal but present. Too much airflow raised temperature, too little caused moisture buildup and rot. Inside the cellar, foods were organized by preservation method and expected storage duration. Root vegetables went directly on the dirt floor or in sandboxes. Carrots, turnips, parsnips, beets, packed in slightly moist sand. These lasted 4 to 6 months. The sand prevented dehydration while maintaining darkness that prevented sprouting. Preserved meats were hung from ceiling beams, never touching each other. Air circulation around each piece prevented moisture accumulation and mold growth. Grain storage was separate. Grain could not be stored underground because any moisture exposure caused germination or rot. Grain required dry storage at room temperature or slightly cooler. The solution was sealed ceramic or wooden containers stored in the driest part of the house, typically near the hearth, but not close enough for heat damage. The containers were sealed with beeswax or animal fat to prevent insect and rodent access. A household required approximately 200 to 300 kilograms of grain for winter, primarily wheat, barley or rye depending on regional agriculture. This was ground into flour as needed. Fresh grinding preserved nutritional value and reduced weevil infestation in stored flour, though some insect presence was inevitable and accepted as normal. The active pantry was the accessible storage area inside the main living space. This held the current week's food supply. The logic was simple. Opening the root cellar multiple times daily released cold air and raised temperature. Instead, the cellar was accessed once per week. A week's food was transferred to the active pantry. The cellar remained sealed the rest of the time, maintaining stable temperature. Medieval people were building what modern engineers call a cold chain, a systematic preservation and storage protocol that maintained food safety without powered refrigeration. They did not understand microbiology, but they understood that cold, dry, dark storage prevented food spoilage, and they engineered systems to maintain those conditions. Section 5. The backup plan. But protocols assume normal conditions. Winter 1315 was not normal. What if winter lasted longer than expected? What if stored food was insufficient? What if preservation failed? Medieval peasants had backup plans, multiple layers of food security. The first backup was pottage. This was not a specific recipe. It was a concept, a continuously maintained stew that incorporated whatever was available. The base was water, grain, and root vegetables. This simmered in a pot hanging over the fire, essentially forever. As ingredients were consumed, new ingredients were added. Water was added to maintain volume. Pottage was infinitely expendable. Running low on food, add more water. The stew became thinner, but it remained edible. Add foraged greens, add old bread, add bones for the third or fourth boiling. As long as liquid remained and heat was maintained, something edible existed. Nutritionally, pottage was surprisingly adequate. Grains provided carbohydrates and some protein. Root vegetables provided vitamins and minerals. If any meat or meat bones were added, protein content increased. Historical analysis suggests peasant diets based heavily on pottage could sustain life indefinitely, though not comfortably. The second backup was forage food. Even in winter, certain foods remained accessible. Nuts stored by squirrels could be found and taken. Medieval law often prohibited this, but starving families ignored such restrictions. Pine nuts from conifer cones. Acorns, though these required extensive processing to remove toxic tannins. Rose hips, rich in vitamin C, remained on bushes through early winter. Desperate families dug through snow to find frozen root vegetables missed during harvest. They trapped small animals. They fished through ice holes. The yield was minimal, but every calorie mattered during crisis. The third backup was controlled semi-starvation. This sounds grim, but it was a calculated survival strategy. Medieval people understood that reduced activity required fewer calories. During the worst winter periods, healthy adults deliberately reduced food intake and increased sleep. They were effectively hibernating. Historical records document this practice. Accounts from famine years describe families sleeping 16 to 18 hours per day, waking only to maintain fires and consume minimal food. This reduced caloric requirements by 30 to 40%. It was miserable. But it worked. Records from 1844 document French citizens in Burgundy spending days in bed, packing their bodies together to stay warm and eat less food. The final backup was community sharing. Villages maintained communal food reserves, typically controlled by the manor lord or church. In extreme circumstances, these reserves were distributed, not equally, not generously, but enough to prevent total starvation. This multi-layered backup system reveals sophisticated risk management. Medieval peasants understood probability. They knew most winters were survivable with standard preparations. They knew some winters exceeded standard preparations, and they engineered redundancy into the system. Phase 3, the dark months, December to February. Phase 3 began December 1st and lasted until February 2nd, Candlemas. This was called the survival phase. All preparation was complete. Now the protocol focused on resource management and psychological endurance. Section 6, the fire management. Winter survival ultimately depended on one critical resource, fire. Food could run low, hunger was survivable, but loss of fire in -20-degree weather was death within hours. Fire management was not casual. It was a formal protocol with designated responsibilities. Every household fire required constant attention. The primary hearth fire was never allowed to go completely out from December to February. Banking the fire for overnight required specific technique. Before sleep, the fire was built up with the largest logs available. These would burn slowly for hours. Once the logs were well established, the fire was covered with a thick layer of ash. This reduced oxygen supply, slowing combustion without extinguishing it. In the morning, the ash was raked aside, fresh kindling was added, and the fire was revived from the remaining coals. This technique required skill. Too much ash, and the fire died. Too little ash, and the fire burned through the night, wasting fuel. Historical accounts describe master fire tenders who could bank a fire that lasted 12 hours with minimal fuel consumption. But fire management was more than technique. It was also psychology. Medieval people understood that fire was not just heat. It was light in darkness. It was security. It was the center of social life. The hearth was where families gathered, where stories were told, where tools were maintained, where the day began and ended. Losing the fire was not just a physical crisis. It was a psychological one. This is why communities had designated firekeepers. If a family's fire died, a neighbor would provide coals to restart it. Refusing to share fire was among the worst social violations. Several medieval legal codes specifically address this. Denying fire could result in expulsion from the community. The fuel consumption calculation was precise. 50 kilograms per day was the baseline, but consumption varied with temperature. A -30-degree night required double the normal fuel. Families monitored weather closely. When extreme cold approached, extra fuel was brought inside. Running out to the woodpile in -30-degree darkness was dangerous. Medieval people were managing energy resources with remarkable sophistication. They understood thermal efficiency. They understood resource budgeting. They understood that the fire was both practical necessity and psychological anchor. Section 7. The winter wardrobe. Medieval winter clothing was not random layers. It was a calculated insulation system that modern outdoor gear is only now rediscovering. The base layer was always linen, never wool against skin. Linen absorbed perspiration and prevented the dampness that caused hypothermia. Over this came multiple wool layers, a wool tunic, a second wool tunic, a wool cloak, wool stockings, and wool mittens, not gloves. Mittens kept fingers together to share warmth, far more effective than separating each finger. Each loose layer trapped air. Still air is an excellent insulator. The multiple layers created air pockets that retained body heat better than any single thick garment. And medieval craftsmen treated wool with animal fats and beeswax, creating water resistance. Waxed wool shed rain for hours. Here is the critical knowledge. If wool became soaked, medieval people kept wearing it. Wet wool still insulates. Wet cotton kills you. They understood this empirically centuries before modern thermodynamics. Historical evidence suggests a typical peasant family owned approximately 20 pounds of wool clothing, requiring hundreds of hours of summer processing, shearing, cleaning, spinning, weaving. This was survival preparation, not casual handwork. Section 8. The Survival Psychology. But the final challenge was psychological. 126 days of cold, darkness, confinement, and monotony tested minds as much as bodies. Medieval people engineered solutions. First, communal sleeping. Everyone slept together on shared platforms piled with 2 feet of fresh straw for insulation, creating air-trapping mattresses that separated sleepers from frozen ground. Physical proximity maintained social bonds and prevented the despair of isolation. Second, scheduled celebrations. The medieval calendar included numerous winter feast days, especially the 12 days from December 25th to January 6th. Using precious food for celebration seems wasteful, but the psychological benefit was calculated. Communities that maintained these traditions had higher survival rates than those that abandoned them. Third, structured daily activity, morning fire building, food preparation, tool maintenance, handwork, evening storytelling. Structure provided purpose. Purpose prevented despair. Modern survival psychology confirms groups with routine endure hardship better than groups without structure. Long winter nights were when knowledge transferred between generations. Agricultural techniques, tool making, food preparation. The stories were education, the oral preservation of survival knowledge that ensured the protocols continued. We are building a community of people who recognize that historical knowledge contains practical wisdom. If you appreciate learning what actually worked, not what we assume worked, join us by subscribing. Section 9. The validation. Did these protocols actually work? Archaeological and historical evidence provides clear answers. Analysis of skeletal remains from medieval graveyards shows mortality patterns. Death rates increased during winter, as expected, but the increase was not catastrophic. Most individuals survived winter year after year. Bone growth patterns indicate most people experienced seasonal food scarcity, but not starvation severe enough to halt growth. Historical records from manor courts, tax documents and guild ledgers reveal that normal winters, even harsh ones, did not cause widespread death. Communities survived. The winter of 1315 was the exception. A volcanic eruption in Indonesia disrupted global climate. Europe experienced the coldest, wettest conditions in centuries. This was the Great Famine, and mortality was severe. But significantly, regions that maintained traditional preparation protocols fared better than those that had abandoned them. Modern experimental archaeology validates medieval techniques. A 2013 experiment in Russia placed researcher Pavel Sapochnikov in a medieval farmstead for 6 months during winter, using only 9th century tools, clothing, and shelter. He survived comfortably. The protocols worked. Medieval winter preparation was not superstition or luck. It was effective engineering based on centuries of accumulated knowledge. Medieval peasants were not primitive people hoping to survive. They were engineers executing refined systems. They understood energy management, food science, and risk mitigation without modern terminology. And perhaps in understanding what they knew, we recognize what we have forgotten. Not the specific techniques, but the principles, that preparation matters, that knowledge must be preserved, that survival is systematic, not accidental. This video is part of a series examining medieval technical knowledge. The next video covers how medieval blacksmiths created steel that lasted 800 years, while modern tools fail in 2. Subscribe to continue this exploration of forgotten engineering. Thank you for watching.